I remember the moment my world completely fractured like it had been built on glass and someone had just slammed a baseball through it, and I can still feel the sharp edges of betrayal slicing into my chest even though it's been weeks since the phone call. I had spent the morning pretending everything was normal, smiling at my son as he ran around the living room, laughing and calling me Dad, and for a fleeting second I actually believed that everything was fine, that our decade of marriage had been what I thought it was, a safe bubble of love and shared history. But then my phone buzzed with the lab results I had requested on a whim after months of gut-wrenching suspicion gnawing at me in the quiet moments when my wife was in the kitchen, and I could see her reflection in the window and wonder what secrets she carried behind her eyes. And I remember my hands shaking so badly. I could barely swipe the screen to open the PDF, and the numbers and letters swam before my eyes until the words hit me like a sledgehammer. The DNA test proved what I had feared yet never wanted to admit to myself: our son was not biologically mine. I remember the silence that followed was so loud it drowned out everything else: the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the distant sound of traffic outside. It all became meaningless. I sank to the couch, feeling the weight of my own body pressing down on me as if gravity itself had decided to punish me for trusting so blindly, and I couldn't even think straight. My mind raced through memories, trying to reconcile each laugh, each bedtime story, each scraped knee I had kissed and bandaged, as if all of it had been a lie, as if my hands had been touching a stranger's child all those years. And I could feel the panic rising in my chest like a storm I couldn't control, and I wanted to scream. But the sound caught in my throat, because how do you even confront something like this? How do you sit your wife down and ask why? Why she never told me, why she let me love someone else's child? Like my heart was a playground for her secrets, and I remember standing there in the living room looking at the baby monitor and seeing his tiny chest rise and fall, and feeling a tidal wave of love and hate collide inside me. I loved him more than anything, and yet I felt this unbearable sense of loss and violation, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the little signs I must have missed: the times she had been distant, the nights she stayed up late texting in the kitchen, the subtle changes in his features that I had ignored because I didn't want to see them, and now all of it had snapped into sharp relief, and I was confronted with a truth I could neither undo nor ignore. And I felt this need to confront her immediately, but I was paralyzed by fear, anger, confusion, and grief, all tangled together into something I couldn't name or sort, and I wandered the house like a ghost, replaying moments over and over in my head, trying to pick apart the threads of a life I thought I knew. And for the first time in a decade, I noticed the small things: the way the light hit the walls, the smell of her perfume mixed with the lingering scent of his baby shampoo, the way his favorite blanket was folded neatly on the couch like someone was pretending everything was normal, and I realized how fragile all of it had been, how easily it could be shattered by a single truth. I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again, if I could ever hold him without feeling this gnawing doubt creeping in. And I remember the phone ringing later and seeing her name flash across the screen and feeling bile rise in my throat, because I didn't know if I wanted to hear her voice or hate it. And I finally answered, just to hear her cry and apologize, and I wanted to throw the phone across the room, because how dare she cry now after all of this, after 10 years, after every moment. I had trusted her implicitly, and she told me she had made a mistake, that it was a mistake, that she had never meant to hurt me, and that it happened before we were married, and I wanted to believe her. But I couldn't stop picturing the day I held our son for the first time, imagining those tiny fingers grasping mine, thinking that it was all mine, and now feeling like the ground beneath me had been ripped away. And I remember pacing the kitchen at 2 a.m, staring at the tile floor, wondering if I would ever forgive her, or myself, wondering if the life I had built was nothing more than a house of cards. And I felt so alone in a room full of memories and echoes of laughter that now sounded like a cruel joke, and I kept thinking that maybe it wasn't just about my son. Maybe it was about me too, about my inability to see the truth about the people I love most. And I realized with a sickening clarity that nothing would ever feel safe the same way again, that every smile, every hug, every bedtime story would be haunted by this knowledge. And yet, I couldn't stop watching him sleep, imagining all the possible ways this could unravel, imagining conversations I wasn't ready to have, imagining decisions I wasn't sure I could make, and the fear of losing him completely settled in my chest like a stone that I couldn't move, and I could feel my own heart breaking slowly in a way I hadn't known was possible. And I kept asking myself, why? Why hadn't I seen it? Why hadn't I known? And the guilt started to creep. In the guilt of wanting to scream at her, of wanting to run away, of wanting to vanish from this life entirely. and at the same time, I felt this strange, desperate need to protect him from the truth that I didn't even know if I should tell him. And I remember sitting on the couch staring at my hands and realizing that everything I had believed about myself, about my marriage, about what love meant was collapsing, and I had no map for what to do next. I had no guide for how to navigate this terrain of betrayal and longing, and I knew that when she came home, I would have to look at her and talk to her, but I couldn't even imagine what that would be like because the rage and the sorrow and the love all tangled together made my stomach turn, and I could feel my head spinning with memories and possibilities, and I knew that this was only the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face, and the hours passed in silence, broken only by the soft sounds of his breathing. And I realized that life would never feel ordinary again, that everything had changed in a single moment, and I was left in the aftermath trying to stitch together the pieces of a family that now felt foreign. And I kept thinking about the years we had shared, about the laughter and the tears, about the mundane moments that had meant everything. And I could see them all now through this lens of betrayal and uncertainty. And I couldn't stop wondering if I had ever truly known her or myself, and the night stretched on with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the house settling. And I felt the weight of this secret pressing down on me like a living thing. And I didn't know how I would survive tomorrow, or the day after, or the years that followed. And I knew that even if I stayed the same person on the outside, I had been irrevocably changed on the inside, and every instinct in me told me that nothing would ever be the same again. I woke the next morning feeling like I had been run over by a truck. My body was heavy, with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. And the first thing I noticed was the silence in the house that felt unnatural, because usually by this hour I would hear him babbling or her humming in the kitchen, but today there was nothing, just the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards that made me jump as if every sound was a warning. And I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to will my heart to slow down, trying to breathe through the panic that had settled in my chest, like concrete. And I kept thinking about the way she had cried on the phone last night, and how her words of apology had sounded hollow in my ears, even though I knew she probably meant them. But how could someone mean words that destroyed a life I had worked 10 years to build? How could she confess to a mistake that had nothing to do with intention, because the outcome was the same? And I kept running through every memory of our marriage like a detective piecing together evidence that I had ignored for years. The nights she said she was tired but stayed up texting, the faint smell of perfume on his baby clothes that I had chalked up to laundry detergent, and the way our son looked at her with adoration that I had taken for granted. And I felt this dizzying mixture of rage and grief because I loved them both more than I had ever loved anything, but the foundation of that love had been a lie, or at least not what I thought it was, and I couldn't escape the images of what could have happened, who the father could be. And the betrayals my mind conjured were like daggers twisting in slow motion, and I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to curl into a ball on the floor and disappear, and yet I also wanted to run to our son and hold him so tight that nothing in the world could hurt him. And the paradox was unbearable, and I found myself pacing the living room in the early morning light, feeling like a stranger in my own home, noticing details I had never cared about before, the way the sun hit the carpet in the corner, creating a pattern that now seemed like a map of my own confusion. The half-empty coffee cup on the counter, the stack of bills I had ignored that suddenly felt like symbols of all the responsibilities I was failing at, and I realized with horror that nothing was safe. Nothing was predictable anymore. Even the most mundane details of our lives felt like they could collapse around me at any moment, and I kept thinking about my parents and how they had always warned me that love wasn't enough, that trust had to be earned and maintained. And I had thought we were immune, that our 10 years of marriage were proof that we were untouchable. But now I felt that immutability shatter, and the thought made my stomach turn, because I realized that the world could change in a single phone call, in a single test result. And there was no way to prepare for that kind of devastation, and I remembered her face as she held our son the night before. The test arrived, the soft lullabies she sang, and the gentle brushing of his hair, and I felt a deep, aching tenderness collide with the bitterest resentment I had ever felt in my life, and I wanted to question everything I had ever believed about love and family, but the words wouldn't come. And when she walked through the door that morning carrying groceries like nothing had happened, I could feel my body tense and my heart clench, because I didn't know how to look at her or speak without my voice cracking under the weight of everything I was feeling. And she smiled at me and said good morning, and I wanted to scream that I didn't want a good morning, that I didn't want a normal day. I wanted answers. I wanted to rewind 10 years and start over or tear the past apart, and yet I followed her into the kitchen and made some coffee and tried to act normal even though my hands shook and my mind was racing with the worst-case scenarios. And I noticed the way she kept glancing at me nervously as if she knew I was on the brink of something dangerous. And I realized that the tension between us had always been there like an undercurrent, but now it was a tsunami, and I could feel it pulling me under, and I kept imagining conversations that might come out of this moment. The questions. I might ask the lies. I might uncover the arguments that could shred everything into irreparable pieces, and the thought made me want to run away and never look back. And yet the sight of our son playing on the living room rug, laughing with his little toys, made me freeze. Because how could I abandon him? How could I let him grow up thinking that I had never loved him when I had loved him more than life itself? And I caught myself watching her watch him, and I felt the way her eyes softened, and I realized that I didn't to know if I could ever trust them or myself again, and the coffee grew cold in my hand. As I sat there in the early sunlight and felt the crushing weight of a lifetime of decisions bearing down on me. And I kept thinking that maybe this was some kind of test of character or endurance, or maybe it was just life being cruel in a way I had never imagined. And the hours crawled by, and I tried to hold on to some shred of normality, trying to play with him on the floor and smile at her when she asked me questions, but every laugh and every hug was layered with this invisible tension, like we were actors pretending in a play we didn't want to be in. And I started keeping mental lists of what I might say to her, what I might ask him when he was older, what I might do if I couldn't survive the suffocating betrayal. I was drowning and my thoughts became a spiral that I couldn't control, the hows and whys looping endlessly, and I realized that I was living in a kind of purgatory between love and hate, between attachment and revulsion. And I felt every fiber of my being stretch and tear in ways I didn't think were possible, and yet I couldn't stop myself from imagining a future with him, even if it was tainted with lies, imagining moments that would be happy but shadowed by the knowledge I carried like a scar across my chest. And I started to notice little things I had never noticed before, the way he laughed differently when I made a silly face, how he always reached for me when he fell down even though she was right there, the way he trusted me implicitly in a way that made my chest ache with both pride and unbearable pain. And I wondered if he would ever know the truth, and if he did, how it would break him. And I kept thinking about my own childhood, about the lies I had been told and the people I had trusted blindly, and I started to see patterns in myself that scared me, patterns I had never admitted to anyone because they were too shameful, too fragile, to expose. And now they were laid bare in front of me like bones in a skeleton I couldn't put back together. And the day went on like this, a blur of coffee cups and half-hearted conversations and silent glares, and I felt the world tilting under my feet. And I knew that at some point I would have to talk to her, really talk. Not just superficial words, but the raw, unfiltered truth. And I kept imagining that conversation, and my stomach churned, and my heart pounded, and my mind raced with all the possible scenarios, all the ways it could go wrong. And I realized that I had no idea who I was anymore, or who I wanted to be, or if I even wanted to stay
in this marriage at all or run away, and yet I couldn't leave him because he was
the only tether to something I could still love. And in that paradox, I spent hours staring at him, watching him sleep and play, and I felt my own fragility so acutely that I could almost taste it in my mouth like iron. And I realized that nothing would ever be ordinary again, and the house felt too quiet, too small, too heavy with secrets. And I could feel my own pulse in my ears and my body trembling with every step, as if every movement could shatter me completely. And by the time night came, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. I was emotionally raw and spiritually depleted, and I kept thinking that the next day would bring more questions, more confrontations, more confessions, and I didn't know if I could survive it, and yet I had no choice but to face it. And the house was dark, except for the dim glow of the nightlight in his room. And I watched him breathe and felt this unbearable mixture of protectiveness and despair, and I realized that the path forward was entirely unknown, and I could either stumble blindly or make choices that might destroy everything I thought I knew. And I sat there for hours, letting the silence press into me until my body ached with it. And I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same, and I would carry this truth inside me like a wound that never fully healed, and I had no idea how to move forward or how to protect the ones I loved from the inevitable devastation that this revelation would bring into every corner of our lives. The days that followed felt like I was trapped in some kind of slow-motion nightmare. Every Interaction charged with tension, every glance loaded with suspicion, and yet there were moments when I almost forgot when he smiled at me or reached for my hand, and I felt that fierce love that made my chest ache because I couldn't reconcile it with the betrayal that had shattered the life I thought I knew, and I kept imagining confronting her, imagining the words spilling out of my mouth, the accusations, the tears, the anger, the endless questions that I would never have answers to, and I would sit across from her at the kitchen table pretending to sip coffee while my mind raced through every possible scenario, and I noticed the small changes in her behavior, the way she avoided my gaze, how she hesitated when she spoke, how she smiled too brightly when he did something cute, and I hated myself for analyzing her like a criminal suspect while also being desperate to understand her, and the house felt smaller somehow, every room tainted by the knowledge that nothing here belonged entirely to me. The pictures on the wall, the toys on the floor, the clothes folded in drawers all carried the echo of a deception I couldn't ignore, and I found myself obsessing over every minute detail, trying to reconcile memories with reality, replaying every conversation, every laugh, every cry, asking myself if I had missed signs, if I had been too naive, too trusting, too blinded by love to see what was happening right in front of me, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more I realized that sense itself had abandoned me, and I could feel my own mind fraying at the edges like fabric left too long in the sun, and I started to dread the evenings, because that's when the questions became unbearable, when the quiet of the house pressed in on me, and I could hear my own thoughts in every creak of the floor and every hum of the refrigerator, and I would find myself pacing the hallway at 2 or 3 in the morning, imagining confrontations that might destroy us completely, or imagining running away and never looking back, but I couldn't because he needed me, and that knowledge kept me tethered to a life I no longer recognized, and every night I would watch him sleep feeling this desperate mixture of awe and despair, and imagining a future where the secret I carried shaped everything he would ever know, and the guilt started to creep in, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your chest tighten, because I loved him so much, but I also hated that the life I had known was built on lies, and I could see her sometimes, sitting quietly in the living room, reading or scrolling on her phone, and I felt a wave of both longing and suspicion, because I didn't know if I could ever trust her again, and I would watch her watch him and wonder what she had thought every night before he was born, what she had felt every time she held him, knowing he wasn't into mine, and I hated that I couldn't stop imagining all the possibilities, all the scenarios that might have led to this point, and I felt like I was drowning in what ifs and might have beens, and the love that should have been pure felt like a trap, a weight around my heart that I couldn't lift, and yet I couldn't abandon it either, and every time he called me Dad, it tore me up inside because I loved him too much to let him go, and yet I felt this gnawing uncertainty in the pit of my stomach, that maybe everything I did was tainted by the knowledge of the truth, and I started questioning everything about myself, my instincts, my ability to protect him, my ability to be the father I thought I was, and I realized that the person I had been for 10 years was gone, replaced by someone who was terrified of losing the one thing he couldn't live without. And I could feel my own rage simmering beneath the surface for her, for myself, for the universe that allowed this to happen. And yet I also felt this fragile, stubborn hope that maybe we could somehow survive it, that maybe the love I felt could somehow coexist with the betrayal. And I started to notice that every day I was changing the way I spoke, the way I moved, the way I reacted to things, because the old me had no tools to deal with this, and I was being forced to invent a new self from the wreckage of my old life, and I could feel that self-hardening like cement in places where I hadn't expected it, and softening in places I thought were invulnerable, and I realized that the future was no longer a clear path, but a labyrinth, and every step I took could either heal or destroy, and I would lie awake imagining conversations. I wasn't ready to have imagining truths. I wasn't ready to face imagining a time when he might ask questions that I didn't know how to answer, and the fear of that day arriving made my chest ache and my stomach churn, and I could feel the hours slipping past in a haze of exhaustion and obsession. And I started noticing my own habits changing, the way I watched her, the way I watched him, the way I measured every interaction against some invisible standard that only I could see, and it was exhausting and isolating, and yet I couldn't stop, because every instinct screamed that this was a matter of survival, not just for me, but for the fragile human I loved more than anything, and I started to imagine leaving and staying and fighting and giving up all at once, and the contradictions made my head spin and my heart pound, and the nights stretched endlessly with the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on me like